this gum.
The nicotine gum?
Oh yeah.
Have you switched to the gum entirely?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Dude, I've been on. Oh, hang on. All right, there we go. I should sound better now. Yeah, entirely on gum.
How is that?
I mean, I've been on it since France.
Like
Like after my
two
first
months?
week, I was like, yeah. So it's just the game now. I haven't picked up a vape in a while. Oh, it's painful to watch. Crave it.
Yeah. Does it help, though? I mean, isn't the gum supposed to not?
Oh yeah. I mean, it definitely uh, prevents me from feeling like a crazy person. Like it does it. It works.
It's just not as satisfying.
It's just different. Like, I mean, it's never gonna be the same as like inhaling smoke or vapor. I mean, in the
Never
same
is.
way, inhaling vapor isn't the same as inhaling smoke, but after a while, like, you adjust to it. But I still have it's not the nicotine craving anymore, it's the physical habit.
Really?
Yeah.
In terms of wanting to vape, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to inhale things.
Yeah. Nothing like it, listeners. Nothing like breathing carbon monoxide. Nothing like it on planet Earth.
You can be a gum chewer.
Like you said, it's nothing like it.
You can do this.
Not as good.
It's really appealing to attracting mates.
To chew gum?
Yeah, I was being an asshole.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Chew the gum out loud. Snap it.
Yeah.
Snap that shit.
Yeah. Smoking still looks way cooler. I mean, vaping looks really lame. There's no getting around it.
Oh,
It
yeah.
just sucks. But it is satisfying.
Well, the thing with vaping is that you can up the nicotine levels to even higher. At least you used to be able to. You probably can't anymore with all the FDA regulations that are coming down. But you used to be able to turn up that nicotine dial so that when you were first quitting, like smoking, you could become getting more nicotine from the vape than you would from any amount of smoking cigarettes. So like that actually like helps you get over the cigarette craving. So then you start to crave the vape more than the actual smoke.
We immediately switched to a lower, like, I was on a much lower
Hmm.
nicotine. And, like, I can't chew the
But
4 milligram gum either. Like, it
really,
makes me feel sick.
yeah, too much.
Yeah, I can only do the two.
Yeah, I've never really felt sick from nicotine before. I guess I've gotten nicotine headaches when I first started vaping, and
Yeah.
you could get like super high milligrams, and I would get like nicotine headaches from like going too much because you just vaping all day long,
Yeah,
just
well, that
puffing
was the
along
other
on
thing.
that
Even though
thing.
I was on like the lowest level of nicotine that you could get for a vape, it was constant. And I had like this constant kind of like anxiety about will I be able to vape at the next thing I'm doing? Like, don't I get all of my vapes in now?
Oh, really?
But it's surprising how quickly you adapt. I think also it helped that I was like in airports for a solid 24 hours straight when I was going, so I like had already sort of adjusted a little bit.
Yeah. When I go to airports, I just vape in the bathroom stalls.
But like on a plane, what do you do? Like say you're on a 9-hour flight, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, a 9 hour flight, you'd have to get like
Some gum. You gotta get
gum,
some gum.
or like I don't, my vape. It there's a little bit of a smell because I just use like tobacco flavored vape, and which, I mean, if listeners don't know this, if they do, it doesn't taste like tobacco, right? It doesn't taste anything like it, but it's closer than like I don't want to be like
Like
lemon cotton
tastes like
candy, like
tobacco perfume,
yeah, and it's not like it's like
tobacco scented perfume.
it at least doesn't like reek up like a bathroom if I were to puff a few vapes in an airplane bathroom. Like it doesn't like reek it up like lemon cotton candy or blueberry or something. So you get away with a few hits, not like crazy hits, just little tiny ones, just enough.
Yeah.
Get that. That's what I was doing at Disney World too. I would go there and I would just like puff. You're not supposed to vape or smoke in places, but shit, dude. That pisses me off
It is
too, man.
liberating, though. It is liberating being like, I don't have to worry about this.
Yeah.
It's just a piece of gum.
We're all just slaves to the addiction, dude. But that's the thing that is like pisses me off about vapes is that they keep trying to regulate them as if they are tobacco, and I mean like as if they are the exact same thing. And like they are not. They are not. Like they're like, oh, you can't vape in here. It's like, yeah, well, it's a completely different from smoking, dude. Like this does not stink up the whole fucking place for months if you light a cigarette like it would if you light a cigarette or something. Like this literally dissipates in a couple seconds, and you're gonna sit here and tell me like, oh well, it's just as bad. No, it's not. It's not even fucking close, and we all have to pretend in order to pass these fucking laws to treat them exactly the same, and it just pisses me off, dude, all the time. I'm just like, oh yeah, this is not the same as smoking, not even fucking close. Not like all the things you would complain about smoking, right?
Well,
I'm
it's not
not.
tobacco.
Well, I'm not even talking health issues,
This
right? Like
is
I'm not.
not
Yeah,
tobacco.
I'm not even talking like health stuff. I'm just talking like it doesn't smell up the whole area like a fucking cigarette does, right? It doesn't get in your way when you're just walking by, like kind of thing. Oh, and you
Right.
get the stench or something. Like it's not that. Like so, why are we pretending that it's that? Well, because we
Because
have
kids
to.
are because kids are using them,
Yeah,
I
dude.
guess.
But I mean, that's gonna
But
happen
also
anyway.
because, but well, of course it's gonna
Yeah.
happen. But
Well, that's the justification, right? Is,
you
oh, we're
know,
trying to
it's
save kids,
also
but like they're regulating this more than cigarettes now. So I mean,
I
they're
can
not
understand with
trying to
like,
save
oh,
kids,
they're doing all these candy flavors and fruit flavors and blah blah blah,
which
like
are
shit that
already
you would
banned by the
not
FDA.
like. Yeah,
So,
you wouldn't find that in tobacco, and also it's like kind of
well,
gross.
you do find that in tobacco. That is why the FDA right now currently is
You do
trying to
find that in
ban.
tobacco?
Well, they're
I mean,
current.
like you find like, am I too loud? Because I'm getting feedback in my.
I mean, not on my side, but on your end, maybe.
I don't know. I'm getting some feedback in my headphones. I can't tell. We'll see. Maybe it sucks. Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, like with some tobacco, like, what was it? Uh, Marlboro 27s. Was it 27s that I was always smoking? See, I don't even
When
fucking
I met you,
remember.
you smoked
Brown.
27s. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And like they always had kind of more of a like a sweeter flavor. I'm sure it had some like shit in it.
Well, I just mean in terms of like the FDA is moving right now. There's legislation pending. It was held up a little bit because, of course, Altria Group and the big tobacco companies are suing the shit out of it right now to stop it. But yeah, that's why they're trying to ban menthol. That's why they're trying to ban flavored cigars, flavored blunt wraps, all of that stuff. Like it's trying to be banned. Like why? Well, the guise is to protect children, but I mean, come on. Like banning is just going to make kids want to do it more. So it's like it's not going to help. It's just going to make my life more difficult, more expensive as it already
Blunt wraps
has.
are just a
So,
container for drugs. It's like it's not
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's always gonna be something. I mean, there were
The thing is that
like
it doesn't have to always be something. That's what pisses me off is that they could have just left us alone. Like the vaping could have just been left alone. But
yeah, but
no,
it
no,
was
no,
like
no,
also
no.
never about you, who was like someone who was like trying to stop smoking cigarettes. It was about, you know, all the high school kids.
Yeah, which is still, again, what is that, below 20%? I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
I have no
So
idea.
it's been hovering around there for like the last couple decades since we basically, like, the 90s when we had the huge big tobacco lawsuits and all that, basically. When all that ended, when you and I were kids, no more advertising on TV, no more advertising on like certain things. You can't
No
use
more smoking in
cartoons.
restaurants. No more smoking sections.
Well, that happened a little bit later. That was
I
like 10
know, we
years
saw that
later.
die.
Yeah, that happened right as I was smoking too, so that would always be like,
That happened right before I became a smoker. I was
oh
like,
really? Well, I mean, technically I was a smoker underage, so like when I would go to
I wasn't.
shows and you could still
Now I would
smoke.
have been,
Yeah,
right? Because they raised it. Now you have to be 21,
yeah, yeah. Which
at
is
least
again,
here.
this is a new thing that happened at the end of 2019 there. So there's been a war on this from the FDA for like the last couple of decades, but it's really ramped up in the last 2 years. It's been honestly insane what they're doing, but I guess most people find this boring because they don't give a shit. There's only what like 20,
Yeah.
30% of people that smoke or use tobacco products like this. So yeah, most people don't give a shit, right?
Yeah,
But,
now I'm just a slave to gum. Now I'm a gum chewer.
yeah,
I chew gum.
yeah, dude. Fuck gum. Fuck gum.
Yeah. Fell asleep with it in my mouth a couple times.
I have seen those lozenges, and those
Found it
lozenges are
stuck to
quite.
my t-shirt.
The lozenges are quite cheap if you buy them from like
Fuck a lozenge. That
Walgreens.
doesn't give me anything. Like, I
Really?
need to be able to, like, chew on something, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I'm sure they work just fine.
Because I thought about that, because the lozenges would be like good in a pinch. You just suck them, but like that's, yeah, I don't know. War on nicotine, dude, pissing me off.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say male is entirely hostile. No! Dinner.
Resources.
Life with friends is boring. We must not say so.
Take a few big hits from the vape for that fucking poetry book. Did we ever figure out how to say her name?
No, I still say Christle.
Christle. Alright. Heather Christle, like thistle, but Christle.
You know, it could be pronounced a different way, but we failed to do the adequate research to find out.
If it matters, I mean, I had never heard of this writer until you put her on the list.
Yeah, she was recommended to me by a friend who I went to grad school with. That's what I'll say. It was a recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah. Recommendation. Well, it ended up on our fucking list here. I ended up buying a copy and reading it. So, this is Heavy Bored. I'm Andrew Wittstadt.
I'm itchy.
And today we're doing The Trees by Heather Christle. And I've got very little to say about it, quite honestly. And this was originally published in 2011. We have the second edition here, which was published later in 2019 by Corsair, the British publishing house. I think this is probably one of the only ones you can find. It's like an imprint of the Little Brown, because, you know, there's really only like 4 publishers in the whole world now. So you'll be able to find this one on Amazon. As always, we'll link it in the description, because you should always be building your library out. If you don't like a book, sell it, give it away, but buy books, because you need to support books if you like them. Alright, and then let's just do the housekeeping, because I like to do that before I fucking forget. So before we jump into this book of poems here, a reminder to listeners, we're looking for workshop horror stories. You can send those to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We'd like to hear about it, commiserate it. We're going to read some of these with your permission on the air here, and we'll have a nice little show about it. All that good stuff. And if you don't know, our podcast is available on all platforms. Subscribe to whichever platform you choose, your favorite. We're on there. We have a Patreon. For just a few dollars a month, you can receive full uncensored episodes, so you never miss one. You'll never get paywalled out. And that's available at patreon.com/heavyboard. If you can't afford that or don't want to, there are other ways to support us. You can support us by liking, sharing, subscribing on YouTube, any of your various platforms that you consume this podcast on. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, any of the places you can review us. That helps us out. So there's plenty of free ways to support us as well. We always, much love to the listeners, as always. Anything else, Soph? I think that's it. Right?
I think that's it.
Yep, that's it. So that's housekeeping again. Send us your workshop horror stories, heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Want to get into that? That'll be a lot of fun. Alright. Fucking The Trees. Whenever published, we have the same edition of this, Soph. I think we have the same little green copy here from Little Brown. Initial thoughts. What do we think?
I had fun in places. Frustration in others.
Say more.
I feel like this book, it needs, I need more time with it. but also maybe it needs more time.
You mean to like?
Like each, I, like I could use more time reading some of the poems, but there are a lot of poems from my initial read that I thought, and I'm a big believer in reading everything, at least twice, especially with poems. So anything that I say, take it with a grain of salt because I haven't really had the time to, go back and do multiple reads.
Shit,
I
if
did
you'd
for
even want
some.
to, yeah. Jesus.
Um, but I will say that I had a hard time with this book. I really wanted to like it, especially, like when a friend recommends you a book, you really want it to be good. But um, there were a couple poems from this book I liked, and the rest I really find difficult to wrap my head around. I know that I have said in the past, like, I don't know how much it matters that every poem makes complete and total sense. But when it feels like you're trying too hard to make meaning from a whole collection of poems, like you get all the way through it and you're still really trying, it can be a little bit frustrating. And some of that might be about what your preferences are as a reader of poems, what you are looking for out of the experience of reading poetry. Like, if you're just looking to read for the joy of sound, like that might be a different experience than looking for poems that have a specific and singular thing to say. And not all poems do. Some of that is about preference and some of that is, you know, well, I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, I think it was Fran Lebowitz who said, when I get recommended a book by a friend or something and I don't like it, I judge them harsher than if they recommended me anything else. And I
Yeah.
hold it against them forever, like kind of thing. Like it's just like, oh, you recommended this book and I think it sucks. Well, it's forever ruined my respect for your taste, kind of thing. Yeah, which is common, and is how everybody should. You should be critical about recommendations, and you should trust your taste and what you think. But yeah, I did not. For me, I rejected the book entirely. Basically, to keep it short, I found it hard to read. When I was about halfway through, I had to stop just because I was so bored and kind of frustrated with this book.
Yeah, for me
And
it was the frustration,
yeah,
maybe.
what do you mean by frustration?
Like,
We
well,
should.
for me it was like trying to follow, like, what are the themes in this collection, right? Because it is a collection of poems, and whether it's just like, we see a lot of collections that maybe are trying to do something that's like more narrative. We see collections that, try to have some kind of arc or some kind of central theme or um, something that ties them all together. And sometimes, you just see collections of poems that are just like that poet's poems that year. And often, even then, they still have a connection somehow in theme or in style or whatever. But trying, even though these all like, they follow the same structure, at least in terms of form, like they look similar on the page, so you can sort of hang on to that. It didn't feel like much to hang on to. And I had a hard time tracking what was happening in these poems. I had a hard time tracking what were the major themes in these poems, and I had a hard time trying to figure out what, if anything, these poems were trying to gesture toward. And maybe it's, not as much about like having a single concrete thing to say, so much as they should gesture toward something um, beyond themselves. And I didn't always feel that happening.
Yeah, for me I was frustrated with just the lack of everything in this. Uh, we'll get into this and we'll go through a few poems here and it'll come back to it. But yeah, I was kind of very frustrated with it. Not just for what Sophie already mentioned in terms of lack of themes, lack of overarching kind of what's the word for it? Symbolism, maybe, if we want to get fancy with it. Although that doesn't, that's not a requirement of good poetry. We all know this, right? We can all grant the counter arguments, but yeah, I found this very hard to read simply because I found it boring. I found it juvenile, easy. I found it childish, vague. Yeah, and then we texted back and forth about this. We'll get into it. And there's a couple blurbs here. She got a lot of blurbs from a lot of big people. I mean, I guess
Who have relatively little to say about it.
yeah, of course they do. Yeah, but we should let readers know a little bit because people probably don't know who she is. So Heather Christle is the author of poetry collections. I'm just reading from the book here, guys. So it doesn't have all her work, but it has a couple of her books in here. The Difficult Farm, 2009. The Trees, like we said, originally published in 2011, although republished in 2019, which is what we have. And this book won the Believer Poetry Award. What is that? Do we even know?
The what?
The Believer Poetry Award?
We know the Believer, yeah.
What is that?
I mean, the Believer magazine.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Where is that based out of? Is that independent or is that a university or?
Let me double check. I don't remember.
Yeah, I've never fucking heard of it, so I don't know. Maybe I've heard of it and just
it's a big one.
Went through my mind. What is Amazing in 2012, and then Heliopause 2015. Work of Nine Fiction, The Crime Book, is out in November 2019, so that's out. She was a creative writing fellow in poetry at Emory University. She's been in the New Yorker, London Review of Books, Poetry Magazine. From New Hampshire.
Oh, is it done? The magazine had been sold by the University of Nevada, Las Vegas to Paradise Media, which is a digital marketing company. Blah, blah, blah. But it looks like maybe they had a final issue in March.
Yeah, because if listeners don't know this, the literary magazines, they don't make money, so they have to be supported by a university endowment or something like that, because they don't make any money on their own. Poetry magazine, right? Very big, very, probably
Looks
the
like maybe
biggest.
it's now back at McSweeney's. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, something like the New Yorker, right? London Review of Books. Well, they have subscribers, right? So they're not a profit loss, like a profit losing endeavor. But Poetry Magazine, The Believer, every university magazine is losing money, right? Like it costs more than it actually make off the thing. They don't make any money off of it. So you need to have these large endowments to support it, or you need to have a university endowment that shells out a few thousand a year to be able to print and send these everywhere, put them out in the world. So there's that aspect to it. Her MFA was Massachusetts, so UMass Amherst, big MFA program. Is that the 1 year? No, that's Boston University, right?
Yeah, that's BU.
Yeah, the 1 year accelerated. So that's like a 2-year typical MFA, University of Massachusetts.
Massachusetts is either 2 or 3.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
And I wonder if that's where she got some of these blurbs. But I mean, there were a lot of big names. So like, yeah, James Tate blurbs, Mark Dottie, Kathy Park Hong. They all blurbed this. James Tate calls the poems magical. I disagree. Dottie says her poems are wide awake.
Yeah, these are sort of vague things to say about
her
vague
poems are wide awake. Okay, Mark Dottie. What is...
That's the thing about poets. We like to say things that mean nothing sometimes.
Well, because we have nothing to say.
Get away with it.
Yeah, because, again, there's nothing to say and nobody cares, so you can just get away with saying nonsense.
And then we praise our friends because they're our friends.
Right, exactly. The interesting blurb here that I wanted to talk about and maybe make fun of a little bit was the John Darnelli quote, or John Darnielle. Is that how you say it? Darnelli? I think it's Darnelli. Darnell. Listeners that don't know, he's the lead singer of the Mountain Goats.
He is?
Yeah.
I knew that.
He wrote a few novels. I think he's written a book of poetry too. I haven't read them. I assume they're not good, but yeah, that guy's a weirdo. I saw them live once, and it was one of the weirdest fucking shows I've ever been to. Not weird because of like what they were doing or playing, but like weird because of the audience. Like the audience was like the most unusual like group of people that were brought together by this music I had ever seen. Like it was like straight up, like there was like hippies, there were like, you know, the folk punk people, and then there were like straight up like junkies that love it because of John Darnelli's like, you know, heroin songs, essentially, shit like that. Like, it was a really weird group of people that, like, all crammed into this shitty club in Baltimore. Shout out to the Auto Bar, if anybody's listening. Shout out to the Auto Bar in Baltimore. I think it's still there. Maybe it's shut down. I think it's still there. It was the only place to go see, like, cool indie acts in Baltimore for a while, so... Anyway, John Darnelli's quote here, and this is why I want to point it out, is because this is what John Darnelli has to say in the blurb. If you're thinking about a new tattoo, may I recommend dropping your finger onto any random phrase in Heather Chrisley's new book. That's how keen her ear for the off-the-cuff aphorism is, how neatly her lines break into glistening parts. You get the impression of the Oracle of Delphi trying her hand at stand-up or jamming the broadcast of the nightly news. Chrisley's gift for welding surreal visions to living speech rhythms keeps unlocking new surprises, page after page, at least once per poem. You feel like the triple bars just lined up in the slot machine window, and you laugh or cry out. So very high praise from John Darnelli, lead singer of the Mountain Goats. He's going to make it through this if it kills him, right?
Yeah, but all the praises, like, there are great phrases in here.
What do you mean?
Like, there are wonderful individual phrases.
They're magical.
But actually says nothing of the actual poems, which I find frustrating in a review of any kind, or a blurb. Like, I want a blurb to say something.
Yeah, for listeners, a lot of listeners...
magical.
Yeah, a lot of listeners might know this, but, you know, like how the blurb industry, like how it works in the publishing industry, right? You get a contract for, you know, your measly little, like, $2,500 in poetry. You probably won't even get that, right? And then they ask, well, do you know anybody that would be willing to blurb your book, right? Because they're not going to do it for you. Like, they want you to do all that work while they, you know, give you very little in return, kind of stuff. This is how the industry's set up right now. So then you send it out to people. You send it out to maybe like a big chance person, somebody with a big name who may or may not get the mail in time to give you a blurb. And then they just blurb it out for friends, you know, acquaintances. And usually it's just like a favor that's done for you by, like, you know, somebody else in the industry, somebody big that you hope could help give your book some praise and get it out there. So in this case, you got a couple big names, right? Like James Tate, Mark Doty, huge names. I think both those guys are pretty much canonized at this point, right? That they're old enough that they're in all the contemporary anthologies put out by the canon, you know, the canon makers, whatever you want to make, you know, say of that. But yeah. So, you know, you take blurbs with a grain of salt sometimes, because a lot of times it's just people being nice for their friends or whatever. All right, what about this quote in the beginning here that starts the whole book? The Russian translation? Is that a translation, or is it just...
Oh, yeah, I read about what this quote was from, but I don't remember. I should have written it down.
It's in the back of the acknowledgments. It was taken from a poem called Daydreaming in the Midst of Spring Labors, and it was translated by Simic. Charles Simic, for listeners who don't know. And Simic, he taught at UMass. No, he was in New Hampshire, wasn't he?
I have his book right here.
Yeah, but Simic's mainly, most of his career was spent at New Hampshire, right? University of New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not UMass.
Right.
But I guess he was close enough. He probably was there all the time, readings and shit. All right, so yeah, the quote is, I don't care about the flowers which I merely invented to give myself another reason to address you. What do we make of that? Think of that?
I think we can make a couple of things of it depending on how we want to read this book of poems. We have, in many, I think, a speaker addressing a reader, right? And pointing out things in the real world, maybe in the real world, maybe in an imagined future, maybe in a real future that we might read more or less as just a way to address a reader. Or we can read it as maybe being kind of critical of this kind of statement or this kind of way of approaching the world, of not paying attention, of only pointing to things as a means to address something else.
Excuses for expression.
Right. But also a lack of attention to the real world, which I think comes up
in terms of theme.
Yeah.
Okay.
or just paying attention generally, which I think we see in the first poem.
Yeah, when the first poem is what told me, listeners, that I was not going to like this. I like, it's like, okay. I was like, oh, John Darnelli blurb in very 2011, and then I was just like, I'm not gonna like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, what do you think about, like, what do you think is going on with this first poem? It's that air of ruthlessness in spring.
I mean, I didn't think much.
I mean, we have this interesting kind of play with a sentence that keeps changing. So we have, here is the hand on my face. It's not my hand. It's a beautiful day. Like, it just keeps sort of evolving. So I thought that was at first interesting. I can hardly believe anything. What about you who are so frequently touching some part of the world? What is it you're touching today? When I touch the trees think man-child. They are so wrong. But it is a human face I put on. I am hung up under this weather. I am hanging on tight to a swing. When I go up enough, I jump. Then I am not touching anything. When the world thinks I've disappeared, I am just having a little fun. Not much fun at all. Are you sad? Did you touch the world the wrong way? Everything is always happening, and not just for show. I want to show you something. I don't care what. I want you to look where I say. So I think that's a pretty direct connection to that first quote that we were just talking about, right? I want you to look where I say. I want to show you something. I don't want to show you anything in particular. I just want to have something to show you. I want you to look where I say. This is not a poem that bothers me very much. I will say there's a lot going on in the middle that I'm still sort of making sense of, but the more I read it, the more I make sense of it.
So that air of ruthlessness in spring, the ruthlessness.
But I want to know who you is, other than, I can only read you here as the reader.
I mean, there's a lot of this. Like, there's a lot of, like, the random, you, we, everything's lowercase but the I, very 2011.
That is true. That does feel very 2011. Like I said, the caesuras don't bother me. So everywhere I paused was where there's a caesura. These are still, essentially prose poems. I do think there's something here about, like, paying attention to the world and also wanting to disappear from it. Wanting, when I go up enough, I jump, then I am not touching anything. Then the world thinks I've disappeared. I'm just having a little fun. I think that kind of lends itself to some of there are some themes about, like, staying inside, being alone, solitude, not going out versus going out and paying attention to the world. There's a way in which it feels like touch here is kind of a way of referring to, actually happening or existing, right? If you're not touching anything, do you exist? Which, I mean, we know the answer is yes, but, like, it's a playful first poem. I don't hate it.
Yeah, I just don't understand what it is.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's that middle section of this poem, right? From I can hardly believe anything up to I am hung up under this weather, that I have a hard time with, that I, like, can't seem to chew on enough.
Well, and this is why I said I had an issue with the vagueness of these poems, is where there's so little here that we have to do a lot of work to wrench out some type of, well, what is he saying?
Yeah, I do find myself clinging to particular phrases to try to make sense of it. Everything is always happening.
Yeah, and I get that. Would you say these are, like,
not just for show?
Would you say these are like a play on the lyric, or?
Yeah, they are absolutely. I mean, I would absolutely call these, at least. I don't. If not lyric, I'm not sure what else to call them.
Right. call them bad poems is what yeah, the only reason I don't want to call them lyric is because there's no attention to like sound whatsoever.
I don't necessarily agree with that.
Like in this poem.
There were moments where I heard rhyme. Here's the hand. Here's the hand on my face. It's not my hand. It's a beautiful day. Again, I can hardly believe anything. What about you who are so frequently touching some part of the world? What is it you're touching today? When I touch the trees think man-child. There's that anything, touching, they're lined up right underneath each other. It's not like the loudest sound in poem. I think caesuras count as attention to sound, but I know what you mean. There's not a lot going on in terms of rhyme. There's maybe a little bit of consonance, a little bit of assonance.
Yeah. And then like the repetition of the same word over and over again, I think that it just gets boring and dull. I'm just having a little fun. Not much fun at all. Are you sad? Did you touch the world the wrong way? Everything is always
There is
happening.
a point at which playfulness stops being fun for the reader.
Everything is always happening. I'm just like rolling my eyes, okay, everything is always happening. I'm just like, that's what it's the vagueness of things like that. And I know, and I get like people would probably be like, oh, well, that means everything's always happening. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Not
Yeah,
just for show.
There are a lot of other things I have questions about, like, I mean, we get this you in the title of the next poem, you are my guest. Again, I take this to be the reader. I take this to be a poem addressed to a reader, an imagined reader. The poem that follows that one, Je m'appelle Ivan. I don't know why it's in French. Is there any reason why I should
Which
think
one?
that that's important? The third poem, Je m'appelle Ivan. It's on page 5.
My name is Ivan.
Why not call it My Name is Ivan? Was my big question here. Why is it in French? Is there a reason here? And so far, I don't feel like there is.
Yeah, well, that's my biggest problem with it, is that all of these things feel like there's not a reason to justify even the stylistic choices other than just like, I liked it, right? And if like, okay, there's something to be said for that, but when it's every poem in this, I'm just like, okay. It feels like this whole book to me, it felt like a failed collection of poems. Like maybe there is something behind this, but
I feel like there's something behind all of them, but it's just not fully there yet on the page.
right.
And I think I could like these poems if they were just a little bit more at the surface. And I know that there are some people who, would criticize that. And like, that's fine. You don't need to want that. I don't give a fuck. But yeah, I found myself really, usually even on a first read of a whole collection as you're reading, you really start to understand what the themes are. And I feel like I was in some ways really relying on reviewers to tell me what those themes were. And in some ways they could not.
Yeah, and that's something too. Sophie sent me a couple of these reviews. I could barely get through any of them. And it was just like the same thing. And this is what we've talked about this a lot. This is a reoccurring theme on this podcast, right? Is like the poetry, poetry's place, right? Like poetry's kind of, what's it for the audiences? Even not even talking like, it's a popularity or anything. We've done a couple episodes, listeners. You can go back and catch all of those at patreon.com/heavyboard. But yeah, I think that's a big kind of, academics are the only ones that kind of review poetry. It's academics, and then it's basically amateurs, like Instagram poets, right? That's who reviews poetry.
Bloggers.
Yeah, which I would call amateurs. Yeah, Instagram poets. And it's like, that's who reviews poetry. And the reason I often say hyperbolic things on this podcast, like poetry is dead or something, is because when you read reviews like that, like there's just the rule right now that you cannot write a negative review of a book. It has to be only praise, no matter how well you like, no matter how you contort it into something, you just have to praise it. So like every review I've read of this, again, like Sophie said, is kind of praising something that I think isn't even in there. And just, I mean, listeners, you can decide for yourselves. You read this book, right? But yeah, that's going to be coming back up as we make our way through here. And that's why I asked if these were lyric, because when I was about halfway through, I was just like, are these lyric? Is she trying to play on the lyric? Is there, you know, I don't want to just be like criticizing something for no reason. Like I try to be, at least I think I try to be as fair as I can be. Like really trying to be like, all right, is there something here, or am I just being an asshole? You know, like, am I purposely not seeing something, or is there something that just maybe didn't work out? You know, she was trying to do something, and I just have been really struggling to find that. So that's why I just say, like, I've found this book frustrating. It was hard for me to get through. I didn't like it. I wrote down in my notes, it's one of the worst poetry books I've read in a while. But I guess so far in this podcast, we have been reading kind of like the greats, you know, kind of like...
Yeah, we've read some contemporary stuff.
Yeah. Was there anything in particular you wanted to, like a poem you wanted to discuss? Because I had almost nothing that... Which is very rare for me, which is again, like, I was like, man, there isn't one poem in here.
One that I struggled with, not just in the poem, but elsewhere in the book, was My Enemy on page 10. And I just want to ask, like, do you know what my enemy is supposed to be? Or is it supposed to remain ambiguous?
Oh, I mean, I have no idea what any of these are.
I have a new enemy. He is so good looking. Here is a photograph of him in the snow. He is in the snow. And so is the photo. I put it there because I hate him, and because it is always snowing in the photograph. My enemy is acting like there are no neighbors, but there are always neighbors. They just might be far away. He is 100% evil and good looking. He looks so good in his parka in the snow. If you asked, he would call it a helmet. All he ever does is lie. He does not breathe or move or glow. He is not that kind of man. It is not that kind of snow.
Yeah, like, I have no idea.
Yeah, I really struggled with this one. I was like, okay, all I can make sense of is like, all right, we have an enemy. The enemy is the photo. It is snowing in the photo. The photo is also placed in the snow outside. It is away from our speaker. Is we can get into the, like, the photo is the representation of a real thing. Is that, like, is it the representation of the real thing? That's the enemy?
Well, and I mean, no, I have no idea. But, like, in terms of just an example of what I'm saying, in terms of, like, this kind of structurally failing at almost every level, he is 100% evil and good looking. He looks good. It is, like, it's repetition that does nothing, right? He is 100% evil and good looking. He looks good. And this is the same thing in, like, the one we just went over. So the very first poem that starts the collection, right? Where she's like,
I mean, I think it's that thing that she's doing.
hand, day, believe,
right.
anything,
I mean,
anything,
I would push against
touching,
this and say that
touching.
it's trying to build on that sentence. And also, I'm not I think repetition is a big thing in poetry, right? Like, we use it a lot.
Yeah.
It's whether or not you do so successfully. And I would say, like, I don't know if that caesura after he looks good is needed, because then it would read, he looks good in his parka in the snow. So yeah, I don't think it does that much more, except sort of reiterate, like, you know, it emphasizes this particular image and the speaker's feelings towards the image.
Yeah, and listeners, people that are just listening and haven't read this, there's no punctuation. There's no punctuation beyond the caesura kind of standing in here. And it's used way too liberally, in my opinion. It's all over the place in terms of the caesura structure. But yeah, that's another thing where I'm just like, these kind of, like, the repetition here, when he said he's good looking, he looks good, is the same as, like, that kind of, like, in that air of ruthlessness in spring, the first poem on page 3, I'm just having a little fun, not much fun at all. Like all this kind of like repetition, it doesn't do what, like, because what is repetition usually used for? I guess we should say power, emphasis, sometimes sound if you're doing a good little sounding thing.
Yeah, I also think saying someone's good looking and saying someone looks good are two different statements. But
Right
it
after
doesn't
one
feel,
another.
yeah, but it also doesn't feel like it's doing that much in this moment.
Well, I would say it's doing nothing. So if we cut that entirely, he is 100% evil and good-looking. Shizora in his parka, break in the snow. If Shizora, if you asked Shizora, he would call it a helmet. Shizora, all he ever does is lie. Like it wouldn't matter at all. Like that's my whole point with that example, like that. Whereas, like you said, to basically just prove your point is what you're the point you're making. Whereas in the first poem, in page 3, that air of ruthless things, I would grant your point in that, where I'm just having a little fun, not much fun at all. That changes it a little bit more than just the kind of he is 100% evil and good looking. He looks good. Like it's a little bit different. So I would say like the use of the repetition in that first poem is more successful. Although those first couple lines with it repeats hand 3 times, I don't think it works well there. But yeah, just to say, yeah, your point is taken there for sure. But yeah, my enemy.
And yet I'm not a tree on page 13. We could talk about. That one felt more direct to me. Not every piece of it, but again, I was sort of clinging to what immediately jumped out at me as something that I felt like I could cling to in terms of trying to figure out what themes we were looking at in this book, or, even just in individual poems. This one jumped out at me. I have no relatives. I can't move. Therefore, I am covered in snow. My inability to speak has saved me from attending endless parties. Among my friends, I count the window. Opportunities surround me. And fame, the famous sidewalk, the famous building, everything is fine. I do not possess a license in this state, or any. I'd like to cry out, any, in my sleep. I never do. Never sleep. Never turn around to watch the chimney. I do not know how to hold a rifle. What birds have for me is not respect.
Yeah.
There are a lot of moments in this one that I still struggle with, including the last line. I guess the last 2 sentences.
Well, if I'm being generous, and yet I'm not a tree, comparing or like the speaker, not necessarily the poet, right, listeners? We have to be, we have to make that distinction. And yet I'm not a tree. But the problem is that the comparisons between the, a human stand-in, i.e. speaker, versus what it compared to a tree, it's just not enough, right? Like it's just kind of unearned. Like the things are so vague that it's kind of like, well, and yet I'm not a tree. It could be, and yet I'm not a rock. And yet I'm not a stone, and yet I'm not a branch or whatever. I'm not a cloud. I'm not, it could be anything, because all of that shit could be the same, make the same statement, right? And this is what I mean about the vagueness, is that it's so vague that it kind of really flirts with meaninglessness, which is why we struggle with it. So if I'm being generous, and so it's comparing, a person or a fictional speaker or whatever we want to call it, to what a tree does, right? So the tree doesn't turn to watch the chimney, can't hold a rifle, can't possess a license, can't cry out in its sleep, can't even count windows. Do birds respect it? I don't know. Probably not, right? But yeah, so like that. So if I'm being generous, this one is less vague, but still, like, this is a good example of kind of, not quite reaching what it set out to do. At least I think.
Right, because even here we're kind of clinging to the most tangible things in the poem, right? Like I'm fully with it up until from attending endless parties. My inability to speak has saved me from attending endless parties. Oh, and among my friends, I count the window. So there's like this also, this is where maybe we get like a theme of solitude or loneliness or some kind of aloneness, right? And maybe there's some relationship to trees there and to nature. We also have something about like what we pay attention to. I never turn around to watch the chimney. I do not know how to hold a rifle. Right? Those aren't just things that you could necessarily not, do because you're a tree, but
Right.
things that you just might not pay attention to doing or might not ever try. So this one, I was sort of there, but it does also start with like, I have no relatives, and that, immediately to me signals like a loneliness, which I think is sort of strung throughout all of these poems.
But then, listeners, you can hear us doing a little work for that, right? So there's a cool little line here, right? I have no relatives. I would say that's a pretty good line in a poem. I think the last line, too, what birds have for me is not respect, right? Like, I think that's a great little poetic line. The problem is that the rest of the poem just doesn't, fails in that
We also
regard.
need something more about what birds do have for you. Like, we need some gesture before that, right?
Or reference to birds in some way. At least that would be a more structured poem. So if
Or,
we
I
mention the
mean,
birds, something
do
about the friends,
birds
comparing the friends to birds, snow, anything like that.
do birds not respect trees? Do they respect trees? Like, what am I
Well,
supposed to believe about birds' relationship to trees other than that they live in them? Do they respect them? I'm not sure how to read that one there. Am I supposed to read it in terms of we just have rifle before it? Would they respect her if she knew? Would they respect the speaker if they knew how to hold a rifle because
so it kills birds mostly.
that's that can kill them?
Right.
So there's a lot of ambiguity here. And not necessarily the kind of ambiguity that I personally want. Like, I like where this is going as a poem. I think
And
there's
it's
something more that I want from it.
yeah, and it's I think we should keep in mind too as we read through this, and listeners should too, with this kind of this came out in 2011, which means she was probably writing it in the couple years before that, right? And then it takes a while to get it published, probably a year or two. So maybe she's spending 4 or 5 years writing this book, maybe, right? I don't know. I didn't look that up. She could be a fast writer, who knows? But let's say it's on average 4 years here. Right at that time, what was happening? Well, social media was started taking over the world, and by that started very much to usurp the art of poetry. So social media now literally I argue often that social media was the death knell to poetry, and like we're hearing it ring out every day, basically. And I think this was the beginning of that. Is like, look how vague I can be, and people still pretend that there's a point to it, right? Look at how empty the platitudes I can repeat are, and we just pretend that it's actually saying something. Like we bend over backwards to be like, oh, how beautiful, how well done. And I think this, not that this book symbolizes that entirely, right? I would never try to make such a claim, but I think it is something that needs to be kept in mind in terms of the last decade, what has happened to poetry. Yeah, especially somebody came out of UMass, right? UMass Amherst, considered one of the top programs, and a lot of these considered MFA. I guess they don't rank them anymore, but we all know, like, even though they don't rank them, right? That's another fake thing they do, right? Oh, we don't want to rank the MFA programs anymore. We just already know. Because ranking implies that one is better than the other, and they're all just equal. They're all just the same. But yeah, that was happening. One I wanted to touch on, it's a short one, dude. Poem ending with some advice on page 18.
Oh boy. I'm just eating this oatmeal cream pie.
Yeah.
My husband bought them.
And Little Debbie, if you're interested in advertising, please contact us at heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We'll
First, do
set
you
it
want to
up.
talk about the poem right before it?
Yeah, I mean, I literally had nothing that I wanted to talk about particularly, so if you want to, yeah.
So, okay, one of the poems that I was like, kind of like, okay, like maybe I'd read this book, like, is the book that's on the back of this poem. The book that is on the back, or the book that's on, the poem that's on the back of this book. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay, the poem that is on the back of this book made me kind of intrigued. And the poem is the poem on page 17 called The Whole Thing is the Hard Part. You have to live where the house lands on you. What else can you do? Your bones are all broken, and somebody loves you. Who is it? Tell me who loves you. Not as much as I do. I mean, I even built you a house and found you. Why won't you live in it? This one to me feels like a direct address to the reader that like I don't really need additional explanation on.
What would you say this is about then?
But at the same time, so here there is something that like baffles me, right? Because I kind of read this as like where the house lands on you is like, you know, you end up sort of where you end up in life, right? And maybe I'm doing that thing where I'm reading too hard into the poem to make it too relevant to like my personal and real life. Right? It doesn't always have to be that. But that's how I'm personally making sense of this one.
Which is fair game. That's
But
perfectly reasonable.
you end up in the moment you end up, surrounded by people you love, maybe one, maybe a whole family, whatever, and you are tied to that. And you are also maybe hurt by that. You have to live where the house lands on you. What else can you do? I mean, it's also a reference to The Wizard of Oz, I assume.
Have to be. There's no way you can reference to a house landing on top of you without
No.
being referencing that huge piece of culture from, early 20th century there. When was that? 1930s? Wizard of Oz?
Yeah. But I think it's like, you have to live where your life happened, right? Where you built your life, essentially, but, where the house fell on you. But why won't you pay as much attention to me as I want you to? See, I built you this house. I built you these poems. Why won't you come live here with me?
You have
Like,
no
it's
power
an
here.
urge.
Be gone before somebody drops a house on you. Oh yeah, I love Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought this was a good one.
Yeah, so the whole thing is life. Homemaking.
Yeah, you have to live your life. I want you to live here. Who loves you as much as I do? I wrote you these poems. I built you this house. Why don't you come live in this house?
I mean, I didn't like it, but yeah, I'm willing to accept any type of. I mean, I'm searching for it. Like, I wish somebody could give me an answer. Yeah, to this. Like, explain it to me. But yeah,
But yeah,
you're
talk about the next.
yeah.
Oh,
well,
no, go ahead.
Well, the only reason I wanted to talk about that next poem, dude, is because I'm pretty sure it's about a Geico commercial from like 2010.
Yeah, me too.
If that doesn't sum up my thoughts on this, I don't know what else to tell. Poem ending with some advice. This is how. All right, so listen up, listeners here. I want to live in the rectangle. It lights me up. I swear. It is nothing I have ever seen before. Reject this season, I said to myself, and fucked it out of existence. Thank you for coming. I am happy to see you. It is nice to see you. From across the prophylactic lake, here is my advice. If you want to make a commercial about two tortoises with internet trouble, their house should be a one-story ranch. If you want people to, if you want people to, believe you.
Yeah, I had a hard time with this one.
So there's
Like,
no
I got the
epigraph.
commercial reference.
Right. There's no epigraph saying that. There's
It
no
has-
reference to it. But it's referring to a stupid Geico commercial, right? And it's about a tiny little piece of logic about turtles living in a fucking house for an insurance company commercial. And like I said, listeners, I think this just sums up my frustration with the book here. Like, this is just, okay, so this is about a fucking Geico commercial, and not even like, oh, it's larger implications or something about advertising, life, whatever, these big themes this book's trying to touch on, but just about how could a turtle get up steps? Fuck you, dude. Like, no. Like, fuck you. Like, no. I was like, this is about a Geico commercial? Are you fucking kidding me? You fucking kidding me? And James Tate called these magical? Tate called these magical. Oh my god. I mean, I guess I just sound like an asshole, but whatever.
I mean,
Everybody knows I'm right, so.
oh, listen, I also felt frustrated by this poem. I did not know what to do with it except for the whole Geico commercial thing.
I don't believe these turtles living together in this house. Oh my god!
Well, and it's just the most real thing we can cling to in this poem, right? It's the most vivid thing we can cling to in this poem. It's a thing that we're relying on in some ways to make sense of this poem, right? Because what else do we have?
Well, it's literally called poem ending with some advice. Not advice to you, not advice to us, but advice to the marketing company that Geico contracted out with and, has been doing their kind of goofy, silly commercials that they've been doing the last 20 years, right? Like the caveman, the gecko, all the stupid
I don't know
little...
what season we're in. I want to live in the rectangle. It lights me up. I swear, it is nothing I have ever seen before. Reject this season, I said to myself, and fucked it out of existence. Thank you for coming. I am happy to see you. It is nice to see you from across the prophylactic lake. I am interested in the prophylactic lake, but I don't know what season we're in. I don't know where we are. Like, are we just inside of this commercial? Because that's not clear to me until the very end of this poem. So I'm like just very confused.
The U. It switches entirely from the I to the U right here, right? Right after, right there in that fourth line. So, and I fucked it, break, out of existence, Shizura, thank you for coming.
It is a sort of jarring.
I am happy to see you. It is nice to see you. Again, that repetition that does nothing that repetition is supposed to do.
Well, again,
from across...
it is nice to see you from across the prophylactic lake. So it's changing the sentence while still also using that repetition. So I disagree that it's doing nothing, but not necessarily that it, I don't know that it's necessary.
Right, I would say the same thing. If we took it out, I'm happy to see you from across the prophylactic lake. Here is my advice. Like, it would work the exact same way. That's my whole thing. Like, if you want to do it, well, then it better not fucking... It should not be able to work unless you do the repetition. Like, that's when you need repetition, right? And you can think of all the best poems you've ever read. All right, let's do the one I always talk about with fucking poetry classes. Let's do Bishop's The Fish, right?
Rainbow,
right? Like, that's repetition. I could not even begin to try and argue that those repeated lines in that poem are unnecessary, because every single repetition, that would be a good example of the power, right, that we use. Fine. The reason that we use the structure of repetition is to create that sense of power and all.
I'm not prepared to make that kind of
but...
statement, but like, I agree on some level, but I also think that there are different kinds of repetition that work in different ways. And I think she's trying to do something here, and it just maybe isn't fully there yet. Because, again, this poem, for me, isn't working. Like, it just isn't there. So nothing else about this poem, except for maybe some individual phrases, is going to work.
Yeah.
Like, and there are places where...
I want to live in the rectangle. It's not enough. And like everything else, I guess I'm just going to repeat myself at this point, because I guess I've made my point. Everything is so vague, and I guess like a lot of people in the reviews and in these blurbs, right, they try to excuse that vagueness away by being like, oh, it's dreamlike. And we talked about this like when we did Kelly's The Orchard, right? Episode 4, listen to it now. The way that, shit, I just completely lost my train of thought here.
We say it's all dreamlike.
Well, when they talk about that, yes, so when we talked about that with Kelly in The Orchard, episode 4, listeners, listen to it now, wherever you get your podcasts. What she does in that, in terms of creating the world, I think that would be an accurate description of that book, in terms of she creates a dreamlike space that you can step into as a reader. This book does not. Like, right, like that would be a good comparison. One book is better than the other. Guess which one it is, listeners, all right? Like, it's definitely not this one. It's the Kelly book. So, and I think that's like an excuse. So it's like a fancy way to dress up the language to say, oh, well, it's a dream. It's surreal. You shouldn't take it literally. It's like, but we don't get enough to tell us that we shouldn't take it literally or that we should, kind of thing. So like it's so, and you'd be like, oh well, she's capturing this in between space, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but it's not even like
Liminality.
concrete enough to give us
It's
that, right?
liminal.
Yeah, but again, like this is, and that's why I think the structure of this, if you haven't read this, listeners, like the structure of this, there's the very strict margins, right? Some reviews called it form. I don't know where they get that from. I guess just shorthand for it's not free verse all over the place. So that's why they call it form, because again, nobody understands or cares about poetry, so they just make things up. But yeah, like that's why, because I think these poems are so desperate for structure, and the way that they're put on the page here, the way that they're written so vaguely, the title's doing almost nothing to give us any type of grounding. If you want to do these kind of lofty, or what some critics call dreamlike landscapes, there just isn't anything there. Like that's why these poems, they struck me as desperate, like desperate to be, I don't know, because I really don't even know what they're trying to be. I guess they're trying to tell us something, but I don't think they're even doing that. Poem ending with some advice, like, come in, like that's just, oh, what a great title.
Yeah, I mean, you get hints of references to like sense of like constant change and how the way that we live our private and imaginary lives. Right? She has a whole poem about that one. And these are like really interesting and like I think fruitful ideas for poems. I struggle with how to make sense of them right now, and maybe that's not what she wants.
I always say that's something too. People always say that, be like, oh well, you're not supposed to make sense of them. Just like, oh okay.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
yeah.
I want to be able to make sense of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
Get the fuck out
up
of
to
here.
a certain point,
Yeah.
at least. Right? There can be some mysterious shit. I don't
Yeah.
care about that. Like, some things can just be beautiful and don't need to mean anything else, and that's fine. But you need something to anchor you.
Yeah.
And that is probably the advice that I have most received in any workshop I've ever been in, and maybe why I'm both sort of drawn to a book like this and then also very frustrated with it.
Yeah, but I think and this is why, listeners, we want to do the workshop horror stories. So send those fucking workshop horror stories in, heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. The way that the poetry is structured now, it is set up for these fucking workshops so that you sit around with a bunch of other fucking amateurs and then they tell you what they think. Even if they're complete morons, they are just like, well, oh, and then you get it all in your head and you start changing things and it makes everything worse. Like, I've never been in a workshop where there was more than maybe one, maybe two people in that workshop that I was going to listen to, and the rest I just knew I could disregard. Like, it is just, I mean, this gets even worse if you're talking outside the MFA world. So if you're talking like community workshops or like, public library, like, oh my God. Yeah. It's just, that shit can fuck you up, man. Like, I've seen people get fucked up over that kind of stuff, especially if you're young, it's your first time, and you don't necessarily understand that workshops in a graduate school setting are designed to allow people to be assholes, settle personal vendettas, things like that. Like, most people sitting in the room with you are not genuinely trying to make the poem as good as it can be, giving you honest feedback. It is score settling time. It is social currency time, whatever it is. Like, that is what makes workshops fucking suck. And again, the fact that you're not allowed to, I guess some people are mean as shit in workshops, and unnecessarily so, but yeah, you're always not allowed to be mean. You're not allowed to say it's not good. No, that could hurt the author's feelings. So then we have to read books like Heather Christle and have James Tate call them magical and pretend that it's all in seriousness. I'm in a bitter mood today, I guess. I just don't like it. What else did you want to hit, you said?
There's Indoors the Great on page 19. There are a couple others. We could skip that one if you want. Another one that's a reader address in Outnumbered. It's a little bit later in the book, around the middle, page 27. Does either of those interest you?
Um, I mean, they all interest me about the same, which is like, 0.
Minimally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was, I do remember thinking of something to be like, oh, that almost works. I think it was like halfway through. I should have marked it, but of course I didn't because I was just so like, all right.
I mean, I think the one on 27 kind of works. Maybe it was that one.
Outnumbered.
Outnumbered, yeah.
At least one of us is alive. If this is happening, either you are reading or I am. Statistics favor you. It seems unfair. You get the living hands, or I will object and kill you. Not because I dislike you, because I like my life. And later, today, in the park, I will only apologize for my lack of regret. I will eat grapes. I will lie on the grass. I will have created a little impossibility. That's all I need, a way in. And then to unfold like a bat.
Yeah, again, it's a poem that more than anything I think helped me to understand or made me feel like I could hang on to something. Like as though I could read this as just being about the address itself. At least one of us is alive. If this is happening, either you are reading or I am. And that was honestly like most of what I needed to understand from this poem, right? It doesn't, we get, I will only apologize for my lack of regret, and I will eat grapes. I will lie on the grass. I will have created a little impossibility. That's all I need. Once we get to a little impossibility, I'm less sure though.
Yeah, well, outnumbered, what is it talking about? Or what could we think, propose, realistically get from it?
My first inclination was statistics. At least one of us is alive. If this is happening, I take this to mean the poem. If this poem is happening, either you are reading or I am. Statistics favor you. It seems unfair you get the living hands. There are also like some weird moments like, you get the living hands, or I will object and kill you. Is that a little impossibility that she creates? Right, like, so again, this is a poem that I think I would have to reread a few times to feel like I made sense of it at all. But I do feel that the title could be doing more.
Yeah. I could say that for every single poem,
I think it's the speaker is outnumbered
yeah. By readers?
by the reader. At least one of us is alive. Either you are reading or I am. It's also weird how these poems are working logically or not,
Well, I would say, yeah, they're not working logically. Like, there's no logic.
But you sort of have to do some, acrobatics to make it happen.
Yeah, well, and this coincides with the internet, social media usurping poetry, right? Logical leaps. We want to talk about that. I mean, I don't know. I
think there's something to be said with, moving by association as opposed to logic, and I think that can work.
Yeah,
and it can work well.
But I just mean it's become like the only thing that matters. So a bunch of random thoughts scattered together on a page, and then 100,000.
I don't even think it's that. I think if it's like if it sounds kind of like a poem, people will. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people would just accept it, right? Especially in the social media world, when you get into like Instagram poetry,
that's
like you
my
can
point.
sort of just write a sentence, and you can argue, poems in the purest way are like composed of sentences. So yeah, you could say that. Well, you could just break up the sentence on the page and pay some attention to how it works with sound, and there it is. But people will just sort of shit out something that's really kind of been said 800 times by any emo teen who like bought a typewriter.
Well, not even that it's said. I just mean like
and slap their name on it and say this is a poem, and people will go, yes, it is.
I just mean in terms of the logical leaps. Like, in terms of talking about one thing and then leaping to something that, like, has so little connection. Like, we call that craft right now, but, like, I would argue it's not. And they'll be like, oh, well, they can put these two things together. I was like, yeah, but, like, what about when it sucks? Like, when it doesn't work
Yeah,
successfully,
well,
which
it's
is, like,
like
what
when
most
you're
poetry is
talking
now.
about like a bad metaphor. Like,
Not even a bad metaphor, because there is no metaphor. I don't even think that, like, would you say there's a lot of
so,
metaphor in this? Or,
no, but I
yeah,
mean, I think it's
that's what I mean.
similar.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, even in this book, that there's not a lot of metaphor. Well, big characteristic in terms of social media, that is what we call poetry now, which is just social media posts. So, yeah, I mean, it's just more of that. I know this is just the beginning stages of it. She went to UMass Amherst, so she had a little bit more of that kind of, what we would just say, what would we call it, the kind of academic training to it. So it's not quite as bad as like a Instagram only poet, but it's there. It was all there. This is when it all started, dude. Like, this is when it all started to just any mediocre sentence could be considered a poetry if we just said it enough. Any mediocre association, any completely illogical leap to another subject mid-poem, that we talked about that very first poem in this book. How in the middle part there's like this really weird leap of logic to things that we just can't quite follow. And it's like, yeah, you know why you can't follow it? Because it's so fucking random. It's like meaningless. You know what I mean? Like, it isn't some fucking mystery that be unlocked with like constant like shit. It's just bad. Like, that's my biggest qualm with all this shit. Like, oh well, if I read it enough, and if I really was as generous as possible, I'm just, yeah. Well, when can we start saying things are bad? Like, when can we start saying that actually this is a bad book of poems? I don't know. It doesn't appear anytime soon.
Oh,
But
definitely not now.
yeah,
We cannot say Heather Christle wrote a bad book.
I mean, I just did. I'll say it again.
We are not saying. Yeah, I mean, what do you think about trying to return the sun?
What page is that?
Because I was reminded, it's the second to last poem, page 59. Trying to return the sun. I don't need anything but you and some light. The world goes on, which obviously like made me think of Cynic, right? But you and some light, the world goes on, getting inferred. It is so stubborn and will not erase things. I think I should scrub out my eyes. You'll recognize me still, won't you? I am much older now, older than I'll ever be. All these eyes in my head, and the light. What distinguishes my face from a tree is the total lack of commentary. As in, that tree loves you, honestly loves you. I'm the noisy one who has to say it.
He's talking about the sun.
Oh, I don't think it's talking about the sun. I think that I still read this as like, a speaker talking to a reader.
What are they saying to the reader?
I don't need anything but you and some light. So there's still like this rejection of needing other people, which I think is something that is sort of a line that's strung throughout all of these poems, just maybe not as concretely as I would like. I don't need anything but you and some light. The world goes on, getting inferred. I don't need those things. The world will continue to go on. I don't have to pay attention to it. Like, a lot of this book is about paying attention. But again, like, there are these like sort of key words that I think I also picked up from reading the blurbs at the front of the book. Right? And you're like, this is what I'm clinging to as I'm reading this book. I think I should scrub out my eyes. Will you recognize me? You will recognize me still, won't you? So trying to return light, wanting to go inward, not wanting to be seen. Right? Back to that earlier poem that we talked about, maybe the first poem. What distinguishes my face from a tree is the total lack of commentary, my need to speak, essentially, right? And it's like this constant distinguishing of people from the natural world, right?
Right.
Not wanting to go outside or not necessarily paying attention or choosing what to pay attention to, or in some ways there's like a sense of being overwhelmed. It feels like there's an anxiety behind these poems that I can't quite pinpoint, and that's fine. Like sometimes the feeling behind the poems can't be like fully tied down, it's just there. But I would like to feel more anchored in this world, in this so-called magical world.
Yeah,
I
like,
think
the
I
thing
don't think
is
she is untalented. I don't think that she is somebody who, like, I think that these could be strong poems. I don't necessarily think they are right now.
Yeah. Well, clearly she thought they were. I mean, they're published in a collection. I mean, let's assume it's intentional. So it's intentional to be this vague, is what I would assume. Yeah, and granted, this is only her second book. I guess
There's a
this.
sense of like any moment I will start living. I will, go outside and do this thing. Like there are a number of poems I think that allude to that too. Like I will.
Yeah, man. And this is why I brought up Kelly, because they keep saying there's a world here, but I don't know what the fuck it is. It's not. Is it like in Kelly's? It was very obviously like a fantastical garden kind of thing, but like this, it's just like some vague thing, like some vague idea. Wouldn't write addressing a reader. I don't know. Be hard to say for me.
Yeah, I struggled with this one. I'm trying to find what I was thinking of, but I've already kind of lost it.
I did have a few
Maybe
questions.
it's Indoors the Great. Maybe it was not.
For what for which one?
That sense of like loneliness and like not actually like wanting to engage with the world, but also needing to, and like being constantly aware of it. Which again is like a really big thing and really hard to like say in one way, and hard to like, it's not graspable. So you have to like do a lot of work to make that come together in a collection if that's what you're trying to do. But yeah, I struggled with this one. Again, the poem that was on the back, the whole thing is the hard part, kind of enticed me a little bit. I think the poems toward the end are a bit more together. The poems at the very beginning are a bit more together, and the poems in the middle I'm still really struggling with.
Yeah, I had a few questions about themes, and then just the title, which just start like, what's the title mean, or what do we think? How would we guess?
I want to say like, the trees, look at those trees, but look at the trees. Don't forget to look at the trees. Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I thought about it for a little bit, and the only thing I could come to was that, well, maybe she just liked it, because I couldn't see very much in terms of like the actual contents of the book, how it like made a whole lot of sense. Which is fine. You can just like things artistically, but it's not enough for me. So again, I just thought it was just, as I texted Sophie about this, and we, as we always kind of talk as we read through these books before we record here, and we take our notes and compare and stuff. It's yeah, I really struggled with trying to give it some type of meaning. So for me, I just noticed a lot of, I called it vanity when we were texting. I don't know if that's the best word for it, but it's clearly about aesthetic choices that are made, and aesthetic choices are important. I'm not going to deny that aesthetics or personal aesthetic choices are a big part of how we enjoy poems, like them, like poets and things like that. But it just seemed like personal aesthetic, and then didn't justify that personal aesthetic with the actual contents of the book. So one of the reasons I was really frustrated reading this, and like I said, called it one of the worst book of poems I've read in a while. I mean, I've read some bad ones, but in terms of like, especially somebody like Tate blurbing this, I was like, oh god damn, poetry really is dead, isn't it? Like, holy shit, this is magic. Then what the fuck is this other stuff? But yeah, and then I had a question kind of about the themes in terms of what are the themes, and we talked about this kind of loosely. I have a few. Um, I said skin came up a lot, and you taught like belonging, containment. It shifts kind of throughout the book here as you read
Hmm.
along, but yeah, I don't know. You said like loneliness,
Yeah.
longing. But one thing I did notice that was absent in terms of is like trees. I guess there's only a few poems that even mention trees, and that's why I was just like, so why is this book called "The Trees, the Trees"?
I mean, I see quite a few. Like, sometimes they're sort of buried in there.
And there's a lot you could work into trees too. So just the image of a single tree, right? Well, we could talk archetypes. We could talk magical realism. We could talk, you know, total fantasy. I mean, talking trees, worshipped trees. Go through human history. There's a lot of like kind of the magical sacred spaces, the trees that we used as like religious grounds, right?
Yeah, I think
Shit.
more than
Sophie and I
anything,
just
I
watched that
got.
House of the Dragons, right? The gods
Right.
wood, right? The fucking
Yeah.
religiously like trees are involved in the religion and stuff like that. So not uncommon thing. I just like I said, there isn't enough in the actual contents of the book to justify it, in my opinion. My last note here is this is a joke. This is why people don't like poetry, like books like this.
Frustrating. I mean, I was just looking at this poem called Good Luck, Everyone. It's like closer to the end of the book. And this is a short book. Like, I read it. I don't usually like to do this. I read this book in one day. Um, I'm a slow reader, as we know by now. And that is also true of poems. I like to be able to like go back and read a whole like section of the book after I've finished it. Now this book is also not divided into sections, so that doesn't really apply here. But I was looking at this poem called Good Luck, Everyone.
Page 42.
Hunger has the man purchase a bun. The man eats the bun, then he has no bun and no hunger. The man lives in Illinois. Hunger has the shape of a different state, a square one. One hunger is much like another, and in the park, similar statues don't move in a similar way. Is anyone hungry? Has hunger prompted anyone to wander slowly across state lines in search of food and tracking one kind of soil on top of another? In the book the man is reading, there is a tree-based society. The women and the men all live in trees. The man gets confused between sticks and jokes about sticks. Each one goes, and then it ends, but they are different. Like there's something here at the end that that I feel very strongly I'm supposed to get like some joke about or some clever trick, something, right? Some playfulness about between sticks and jokes about sticks. Each one goes and then it ends, but they are different.
Yeah, it's a good example of just big flat line for me. Just every poem in this a big flat line and just remains flat.
You know,
Everything.
like I was saying, I don't expect to grasp the book on one go. But usually there are like some sort of standout thing, something that can anchor me in at least a handful of the poems, and even if they're not all great, and they never are all great. Like it's very rare that you find a collection of poems where everyone is great, and sometimes you have a few really fucking phenomenal ones, and maybe the poems themselves aren't individually genius, but the book works on the whole, right? And that's a different conversation about whether individual poems can hold their own or if they, are only working as a piece of a book, and that's a whole other thing. It was hard to find something to hang on to in this book. And I've seen this in a few books that I have read, and it makes it really hard to keep going back to like contemporary poetry. Like, and I want it. I crave it all the time. But then you buy a book of poems, you commit yourself to it, and you want to support, contemporary writers in this, especially in this genre where nobody really buys the books except for other poets. And I'm happy to buy those books, but it frustrates me when you spend the money on the book. Because it's very rarely, unless it's like a famous poet that everybody knows, it's very rarely like something that you can find at the public library or that you can, find for $4 on eBay, which of course is not the same as supporting the author necessarily, but still, as someone who does not currently make a ton of money, like I want a little bit more. And maybe that's like a shitty attitude. It's not really about the money spent so much as like the experience of reading. I wanted a little bit more from this. And it also frustrates me sometimes when people like, this reminds me of you, and I'm like, fuck. Why?
Yeah.
That's a different problem. You can cut that out.
I remember very distinctly times like visiting writers and stuff telling me to check out certain authors, and whenever I did, I was just like, what the fuck were you telling me to check out? Like,
yeah, and sometimes I can understand, like, I understand why this book was recommended to me. And it also, I think, shows some of the same issues that I have with my own work. But I have a hard time with this book. And part of me like wants to return to it to be like, is it often what happens when I read a book like this is I think that I'm the problem. I'm like, I must have fucked up somewhere. I didn't read hard enough. I didn't understand something. And you have to kind of remember that's not always the case. But there is still that part of me that like the student in me still reads something and thinks that because it's published, they must know better than I do.
yeah, but
And it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, dude, that is not. Listeners will know I do not have that problem. I remember when I was a first year grad student, and I volunteered to be one of the readers on the magazine, right, that we ran, and all these people, like the second, third year ones, grad students that would come to me and be like, "Oh, it's gonna be a lot of work. It's sometimes you forget what even a good poem is as you read through." And I was just like, no, I don't have that problem. Like, I've never had that problem. I've never had an issue just reading something and then telling you what I thought of it. Like, I'll listen to people like somebody like, so if somebody like when we did like Bloom, I'll be more interested in like listen to somebody I respect that has a different point, like Sophie, right? Like Sophie will tell me she disagrees, and I care more about that than I would just like personally be like, oh, maybe I'm no. It has to be somebody I respect telling me and giving me a convincing kind of argument or something, and then I'd reconsider. But usually after the first read, I know whether I would.
Right, and if you're like me and you have an inferiority complex, maybe it's like more like my experience.
And that's why I always tell, like, yeah, if you're struggling to figure, oh, well, what's good, it's like, well, then you don't have a taste yet. Like, all right, like.
Well, also you have to like it, and I just didn't really enjoy this.
Yeah, I didn't.
And that's also okay.
Trust your instincts. Everybody's afraid of their own gut now. That's an issue, but. Maybe that's why we only have positive poetry reviews. I don't think there's been a single negative review. I would say, I mean, dude, like in terms of this around this time, like books published after 2010, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 that I thought were good. And like the last decade has been such a disaster for a lot of poems, for poetry in general. Social media killed a lot of things. Killed poetry first, that's for sure. Holy shit.
Well, and everyone's a poet,
And you don't even know it.
Ugh.
Ben Lerner.
Ugh. Don't bring me back to Ben.
Available wherever you get your podcasts. Are we done here? We hit everything you wanted?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I'm done. I'm done with this. Buy it if you're interested, listeners, although this is one you could probably skip.
Yeah, but like if you want to buy it and tell us if we missed something, please.
put it in the comments.
I am so eager for these poems to be about things.
Well, I'm sure you could do. I mean, dude, I turned in a paper in grad school where I purposefully argued, that the Dadists tried to make perfect sense with their poems. I got an A. Like it's a joke. like it's a joke, dude. Like, that's what I mean. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, there is no study of poetry right now. Like, it doesn't exist. Like, and everybody's just kind of like it was such a ridiculous thing to argue, but like, whatever, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I turned in some piece of paper with writing on it. Like,
You like to sound poignant.
yeah. Like, and it's incredible. That was for master's program listeners too. So of course this is. I mean, it's a joke. There is no study any longer. It's a degree factor. It's people that want to talk about it and pretend that they're like, want to do things, want to write poems, want to like poems, because it's kind of like an esoteric thing now, right?
Well, I think people want to write poems. They just don't want to read them.
Well, yeah, I mean, they don't want to write poems. They want to write social media posts. Like, that's just what they do. Like, and that's what it is. So because it's a social media post, there's no structure. There's no attention to line integrity. There's no attention to the traditions or what we would talk about that make what poetry what it is. You know, the thousands of years of writing that came before it. No, it's literally.
We're just saying, be better, poets.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to see better poetry, and I'd like to see people actually trying to do better poetry. But like, it's futile. I mean, that's what I mean. I don't even know if there's a place for that. Clearly it's not wanted. I mean, even the big established institutions clearly don't want better poetry. So then we get books like this. And Tate calls them magical. Right on the front page there. Magical. All right.
There is one book that I like that I think Lena Dunham blurbed, and I was really pissed about that.
What book was it?
It was Khaki Wilkinson's The Winona Stone Poems.
The Stone Poems.
I wonder if that would still hold up for me.
I wasn't a huge fan of it, but just because of her style. But I'm not going to say that those poems were bad, because there was clearly a lot of like, those were very well structured, and then she has a lot of meter and rhyme in those too, something you don't see very often in contemporary poetry. So, and the reason is because meter and structure and rhyme are fucking hard, right? Like, it's hard to do that. It takes a lot of work, a lot of rewriting, a lot of revising.
It's
So again,
also not a part of every poetry education. I mean, if you even get one, if you're like an English major, or if you like specialized in poetry in any way in school, like my only education in meter happened as an undergrad, and I don't think.
and that was because you had one particular teacher that thought it was important, and that's.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, as a grad student, it wasn't even touched.
We had maybe one day on it, 1 week.
We
in
had
grad school.
zero.
Yeah.
We had none, and we talked about sonnets, and we did not talk about iambic pentameter.
Yeah, and this is not, and that's not like some, pay to play fucking MFA, which is the majority of them, right? Like, this was considered a top program, and yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. Like, there is no study, like, there is none. It's
Just write.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a feeling, right?
Just
Yeah.
write your book.
Just write your breakup poems, and we'll
Yeah.
praise the shit out of them for being mediocre. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is.
I did have one class that was like, research something and write about it.
Like, just anything.
And I was like, isn't that like just part of the process anyway? Like, there are occasionally poems where you just have to look shit up. But it doesn't matter.
Oh, they wanted you to look something up about a specific poem, or just like.
No, just like write a poem that was based on research. Yeah, it was really vague and really dumb, and I hated it.
Again, it's Instagram. That's like, the
Yep.
prompts when you get like I mean, if you just go click on like the hashtag writing communities, just click on this and see the posts. I mean, they're either some type of self-promotion or some type of, like Instagram style writing prompt or something that people can pretend to be writers by
Yeah.
scrolling all day and saying that they hang out in this community, therefore. But alright, yeah, we're way off topic now. Any final thoughts? I guess we did it already.
No, just a little gas.
A little gas. Letting out some toots. Little toot in the morning there. This afternoon now. Reminder to listeners, we're still looking for those workshop horror stories. If you like what you heard and you heard what we're talking about with workshops here, that's the kind of shit we're looking for. Send them to us, heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Support us on Patreon for just a few bucks a month. You can get full, uncensored episodes, bonus episodes, interviews, all that good stuff that we're starting to do. Subscribe on patreon.com/heavyboard. If you don't want to pay for that or you can't afford it, you can support us by liking, sharing, leaving a review, 5 stars preferably, on any podcast that you, wherever you get your podcasts. We have a YouTube channels. Like, subscribe, support us on that. Share them if you like them. All that good stuff. And next week, we are doing James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. Classic, instant classic. Very famous book, so I'm sure you've heard of it. We're going to get that going next week. Tune in for that one. Don't want to miss it. This has been another episode of Heavy Board. And we will see ya.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
I may say male is entirely hostile. No! Dinner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.